everybody, in this video I'm going to show you how to make the haunted house block that goes in the center of the Halloween quilt. In this block we're going to use a method of block construction called foundation paper piecing. Foundation paper piecing is when you start with a picture. This is actually the pattern for one of the pieces for the haunted house, but you start with a picture printed on this piece of paper and you sew on the paper. You can see here this piece has been sewn on, but you actually sew your pieces of fabric to the paper. And then you create the same picture that's on the other side. So this block, that's what we're going to do, and I'm going to show you the whole method. When you get started, there's a couple of things you need to know. One is that there is waste in this method, and that's just the way it is. You have plenty of fabric in your kit to make this block. Don't worry when you're cutting off pieces that are a little bit bigger and you think, oh, I'm wasting so much fabric. You're not, okay? That's just the way this method works. So when you get ready to get started, you're going to need your pattern. You're also going to need the following supplies. You're going to need a small ruler, either an add-a-quarter ruler. This is a great, if you're going to do a lot of foundation paper piecing, this is a great investment. Or you need a smaller ruler. The pieces in this are kind of small, and it's going to be, you can use your big long ruler, but it's going to be much easier if you have one of these two things. You're going to need a seam ripper. You absolutely have to have a seam ripper for this, but we're not going to use it to rip pieces out. You need some wonder clips. Pins will work, but wonder clips actually work much better, so you need a couple of those. You need your rotary cutter and mat, and you need an iron. You're going to use the strips of fabric that are in your kit. The purple is your roof. The orange, little orange peels is your windows. Your black is your house. The gray that I don't seem to have any, oh, it's right here. The gray strips are your background. And the orange is your front door. You should just have one piece of orange in there for your front door. All right, let's talk about how to do this because it can seem a little odd at first. We have a mantra for foundation paper piecing, and it's fold, cut, flip, stitch. We're going to say that over and over. Fold, cut, flip, stitch. A lot of people wonder with this method, is my pattern easy or hard? The truth is, if you know fold, cut, flip, stitch, and press, we've got somebody in class who always insists we say and press. If you know those 4 steps, this method is really more of a method. It's truly a method. You're just going to do that over and over. Fold, cut, flip, stitch. And you can foundation paper piece any pattern. Sometimes when your pieces get really small, it's harder, but I really think if you learn this method, you can successfully foundation paper piece almost anything. So your pattern doesn't look like a normal pattern. I want to take just a minute to explain to you how a foundation paper piecing pattern works. Sometimes with foundation paper piecing patterns, you will get a cut list that tells you how big to cut each of the pieces. But I need to explain to you how this one has been written. First, you're going to see a number. So D1, D4, D5, D3. D is the section that you are working on, and 1 means this is the first piece that you should sew onto this section. That's the first piece of this, of section D. D2 is the second piece of section D. D3 means it's the third piece you should sew on to section D. Okay, this entire piece of paper is section D. The next thing you need to see is tells you, the pattern will tell you what portion you're working on. So window, house, BG means background, roof, and there's what color you should use. So the first piece you're going to use is piece D1. It's a window, and you're going to use your orange fabric to do the window. I've also written on here, if you want to pre-cut your piece, some of you may have been in class with me, and there is a method where you just kind of cut off a piece and see if it's big enough. This will actually give you the dimensions of the piece that you need to be able to fit it on. You do need to know that these pieces are oversized. You have more than enough fabric in your pattern to cut all, or I'm sorry, in your kit to cut all of these pieces at this size, okay? This piece especially, this is the 8th piece you will sew onto section D. It's the roof and it's cut from the purple fabric. You're going to cut it 9 1/4 by 3 inches. And remember, so it's going to be a rectangle, and you are going to cut off quite a bit when you add these two triangles, which you'll see in the rest of the video in a minute. But that's how this pattern has been designed. The other thing you need to know is that this dashed line means that that should be the outline of the whole piece when you're done. That's your 1/4 inch seam allowance to sew section D onto the rest of the house. The last thing I want to point out are these little dots. This is reminding you that you should start stitching out here where the dots are. You'll sew down the line and you'll stitch beyond it with, and these 2 dots are there to remind you to take 2 or 3 more stitches, okay? If you have trouble or you have any questions at all, don't hesitate to call the shop. But we now return you to your regularly scheduled video. We're going to start with, I've got one cut out and I've got one ready to go. We're going to start with this, and you'll notice that you've got several different patterns. They have different letters. This one, all of the things are numbered A, A1, A2, A3, A4. This one, they're all B's. So you've got B1, B2, B3, B4. Take out your first piece, which is the A piece. We're going to start with this one. And the first thing you want to do is rough cut around the outside of it so that you're not dealing with the whole piece of paper. The whole piece of paper gets a little bit unwieldy. So you're going to cut it so it looks more like this, okay? You still want to be able to see your dashed line around the outside, but you want to be able to, you just want it as small as you can get it and still see that dashed line. The next thing you're going to do is pull out your chart and you're going to cut the pieces for A, okay? So you're going to find the piece labeled A1. You're going to use your door fabric, which is the orange grunge. This piece should already be cut for you. You're going to find on the chart the pieces A2 and A3 and A4, and you're going to cut those out, okay? You're going to cut them the size it says on the chart. Now you're ready. If you've got your pieces cut and you've got your pattern cut, you're ready to get started. So we've got to set up our machine. So come on over here and I'll show you how to set up your machine. You're going to turn your machine on, and the foot you want on your machine, you have some options. You can use your A foot. If you have a Janome with an HP foot, you might prefer that, and that's, oh, sorry. You're not seeing it. There you go. That's the HP foot. Sorry about that. Or you can use your satin stitch foot. What you are trying to find is a foot that gives you a clear indication of where your needle is going to fall. Because what we're actually going to do in foundation paper piecing is sew on the lines. Remember when your kindergarten teacher told you to color inside the lines? Well, now we're going to sew on the lines. So you just want something that's going to give you a clear shot that you can follow the line, and the line will go directly under your needle, okay? I personally prefer this foot. It's got a slot in it right here, a slit right here. And I like to just be able to put my line straight down the middle of the slit. Okay, so I like the A foot. Other people prefer the satin stitch foot. So you're going to get your foot on there, and then the next thing you're going to do is you're going to adjust your stitch length several times while you are foundation paper piecing. The first thing I'm going to do is raise my stitch length. There you go. I'm going to raise my stitch length. I'm using the dial, but I can also do it on the screen, to 4.0. That's a basting stitch, okay? A basting stitch is a stitch that's meant to be removed later. So all we're trying to do, the very first piece in foundation paper piecing is attached to the paper differently than any of the pieces after that. So on A1, B1, C1, and D1, you're going to raise your stitch length to 4.0. You're going to grab your first piece of fabric, and what you're going to do is put it on the back. When you turn it around to the front, you want to be able to see that it's covering your entire you want to be able to see, and a lot of times, this is going to be hard for you guys to see. We're going to raise it up to the light here. You want to be able to see, you need to back up a little bit. There you go. You want to be able to see that it's shadowing through and that it's covering your piece, this entire piece A1. You want your piece of fabric to cover it entirely, and then we're going to baste it on there, okay? You want it to be sure that it's overlapping everywhere by 1/4 inch or more. You don't have to get out and measure. Just make sure it's overlapping everything by about the same amount, okay? So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna baste this piece of fabric to our paper. And this can be just a little bit tricky to slide it under here. And you can sew anywhere, but don't sew on any lines. You're just going to sew down the middle of A1. It helps if you plug the foot pedal into the machine. Yeah. No. Okay, now we're ready. So we're just going to baste down the middle of the first piece. And we put it on here so that when we flip it over, we see the right sides. This is also a little bit different. You want to make sure that the back of the fabric touched the back of the paper. So when I'm looking at this side, I see my design, and when I look at this side, I see all the right sides of my fabric. Okay? So I've got that first piece basted on there, and now it won't fall off. And now this will make the next several steps easier. Okay, so now we're going to do fold, cut, flip, and stitch, and press. So let's go over to the cutting mat. And if you have an add 1/4 ruler, you're going to use that. If you don't have an add 1/4 ruler, grab a postcard or something that's made of real heavy cardstock. The add 1/4 ruler, you turn it so that the tapered side is up and the lip is up. So the letters here are upside down, okay? Lay it on the line between piece 1 and piece 2, A1 and A2. You lay this on the line between those two pieces, and then you fold. This is step 1, fold. You fold it back, okay? So that what you've got is now you have a fold directly on the line between piece 1 and piece 2. So we've got a fold. Now we're going to cut. If you have the add 1/4 ruler, you flip it over, and there's a lip right here that is exactly 1/4 inch from the edge of your ruler. Slide the lip so it butts up against the paper. If you don't have an add 1/4 ruler, take your smaller ruler and find your 1/4 inch line and lay that on the edge of the paper so that you've got exactly 1/4 inch from the edge of the paper to the edge of your ruler. Okay? So we folded our paper back, and now we're going to cut. I'm going to try to do this without getting my hands in your way. Here. So you take your rotary cutter and you're going to cut. Cut away anything that's hanging over the edge of your 1/4 inch. Okay? Now, you grab the piece of fabric for piece A2 and you flip. Flip this over and lay your piece right sides of fabric together on the edge. And I told you there's a lot of waste with this. I actually designed this pattern. I designed it this way on purpose so that you don't have to fuss too much about fabric placement. if you do a lot of foundation paper piecing, you'll find yourself constantly trying to use as small a piece of fabric as possible without any waste, and that's too much trouble to worry about when you're just trying to learn it. So your pieces are cut very oversized. Okay? Now remember, we folded the paper back, we cut our extra fabric away, and now we flipped this over. We're laying right sides of fabric together so that our raw edges are matching up, just like in traditional sewing. We want our raw edges matched up really nicely. And then we flip the paper back and we flip the paper over. This can be a little bit tricky, but we're gonna flip it over. That's the flip. And then we're gonna go stitch right on this line between piece 1 and piece 2. When you're adding a new piece, you want to stitch on the line that's between the new piece and a piece of fabric that's already there. Okay, so we're gonna go stitch. Make sure my fabric is still lined up. That's the other thing about oversized fabric. You can hang on to it a little bit easier. So now, you'll notice on your pattern you have these 2 little dots beyond all of your lines. Those are there to remind you to start stitching beyond this line. If you start stitching right here, you're never going to stitch over your line of stitching and your whole piece will just fall apart. We're not going to back stitch. We're just going to start a little bit beyond the line on those 2 little dots, and I'm going to lower my needle into one of the dots, and then I'm going to put my foot down, and I'm going to make sure that the slit in my foot, that my line is going straight down that slit. If it isn't, then raise your needle, take it out, and adjust. We need to lower the stitch length on our sewing machine. There you go. I'm going to do it with the dial. We're going to lower it down to 1.3. You want a really, really small stitch length. The reason is the paper is not going to stay in forever, and a small stitch length will perforate the paper and make it easier to take out. All right. I'm going to double check down here that I can lift my paper back and make sure that my raw edges are still together, and they are. And now I'm going to stitch down the line slowly and make sure the line is going directly under my needle. I'm going to stop, and this is a long stitch or a long seam, so I'm going to make sure I'm still got my raw edges together, and I do. There we go. And when I get to the bottom, I'm going to see my little dots that are there to remind me to go 2 or 3 stitches past the end, and then I can cut my needle, cut my threads, and I've got my piece added. So now I'm going to do the important step that if you were raised in my house, you will never forget, but we still need to remind ourselves to do it, and that is press. I'm going to press as I sewed. You want to use a dry iron for this, and I'll explain that in just a second, but you're going to press as you sewed, and then you're going to pull this back, and you're going to press it open. I like to take the point of my iron and run it directly along the 2 pieces of fabric and use that to push my fabric back. What you don't want, it's hard to press the fabric in this, and it's really, really important that you don't get a bubble between the 2 pieces. So just take your time and do a really good job. You don't want to use steam when you are foundation paper piecing. The reason is the steam can actually steam the ink. This is toner, this was on a laser printer, but it can actually steam the toner or the ink. It'll reactivate it, and it can cause it to come up and onto your fabric, and you can get dark ink lines on your fabric, which I don't know about you guys, but after I've spent all this time, the last thing I want is ink on my fabric. Okay, so we folded, remember we folded our paper back, we cut the seam allowance away, we flipped and added our fabric, and then we flipped back so we could stitch, and now we pressed. So we've done all our steps: fold, cut, flip, and stitch, and press. So now we're just going to do that again, okay? We're going to go, the next piece is 3. We're just going in order. 1, 2, now we're going to add 3. We're going to sew on, we're going to use this line because there's a piece of fabric here, okay? So we're going to use this line to do our fold, cut, flip, and stitch. So let's go over here. We're going to take our ruler or our postcard, lay it on the line that we're working with, and fold back. Actually, I'm going to get these long threads out of here because they're just going to drive us crazy. Okay, so we fold. Now we measure a 1/4 inch away from the paper and we cut, and you'll notice here there wasn't any fabric to cut right here at the beginning. That's okay, don't worry about it. Now we flip and add our fabric. Raw edges together, hold that in place and flip it over, and now we're going to go stitch from just beyond, from our 2 dots just beyond the line to our 2 dots just at the bottom, okay? And in transit, the fabric moved, so we're just going to readjust it.
And you're still at that small stitch length.
We're still at the small stitch. We're gonna, the only time we're gonna use a different size stitch length is on that first piece that we basted on there. The rest of them, we're gonna use the 1.3. I'm gonna lower my needle into my little dot, lower my foot, and make sure, hold on. I like to hold this thread out of the way, otherwise it gets all tangled up. So I'm going to hold that away. Okay, lower my presser foot, make sure my line is straight in front of me, check my fabric, and now we're going to stitch right on the line. People like foundation paper piecing because you get really precise points and you can get really interesting looking shapes. Okay, we're at the end, so we're going to cut our threads. And now we are going, I'm going to get rid of this. And now we're going to press. So press as you sewed, and then press open. Press this open. You can't, if you've been in class, in a traditional class with us, you know we press the seams open and then to one side. You can't do that with this method, and that's why pressing is really important, and this can be the downfall. This can be the place where people get distortion in their shapes because you've got to get your seam as flat as possible. Okay, so now we've got a door with 2 pieces of house on the side, and now we're going to fold, cut, flip, stitch to add this last piece. But we've got a problem. Let me show you. When we go to, we're going to add piece 4, and there's already pieces of fabric on all of these, so we're going to use this line right here. But when we go to fold it back, look what happens. The fabric wants to come with us because it's stitched. Remember those 2 little dots. If your first instinct is to pull those stitches out, don't. Instead, you're going to get your seam ripper and you are going to use it not to rip, but to hold these seams in place. You put your seam ripper right on your stitching line and watch what happens. You just sort of pull up and you rip your paper. And now your stitching line is still there and the fabric will lay flat. So we're going to do that to all of these little lines where there's a seam in the way. And now we can fold back our piece A4. So we're going to fold. And we're going to cut. And there's not orange everywhere, that's okay. Okay, and now we're going to take our next big piece of fabric here. We're going to flip over and we're going to line up our raw edges. Can you see that? Would it be easier to see in here? Okay. We're going to line up our raw edges. Okay, if you ever lay a piece of fabric on here and what happened was I folded this back and I thought, I don't know if my piece of fabric is big enough. If it's covering, I can see my fabric. This is the next piece I'm going to add, folded back here. If it's covering all the way when this piece of paper is folded back, and it is, then it'll cover it when we're done sewing. Okay, so I've got my raw edges lined up, and now we're going to stitch. Lower into the dot, lower our presser foot, and stitch. Cut our threads. Trim my long ones. And then press. Fold it back. And now you can take those basting stitches out at any time. Some people take them out as soon as you've added another piece of fabric, you can remove your basting stitches, okay? So as soon as we had put piece 2 on there, we could have removed these basting stitches. Some people prefer to wait until they're all done and have their whole house assembled. Pulling out basting is really easy. I like to take them out now, because now we're going to trim this piece up. I'm going to show you how to do that. But I prefer to take my basting stitches out now, so I don't have to do this a whole lot later on. So I've just slit the basting stitches at several points through and now you should be able to just pull out the smaller threads. So I slit them about every, I don't know, 8 or 10 stitches. Yeah, you can do that too. You can also flip it over and grab it, and they'll pull out, and then you just go grab them off the front. Okay, once all the pieces of fabric are attached, then what we're going to do is trim it up so that the edge is this dashed line. All right, so we're going to go over to the cutting board. And I prefer this ruler at this point because it doesn't move. So I'm just lining the edge of my ruler up on the dashed line, and then we're going to cut everything away. So see, now that dashed line is the edge of my piece. and you want to, after you've cut, before you move your hand here, you want to pull and make sure you got all of your pieces. So there is the first piece of your house. My suggestion is now you do piece A1, or you do piece A, you're going to do piece B and piece C, and then come back for piece D, because what I have done is this is piece B. It's going to go over here. This is piece C. It's going to go over here. And I have piece D almost completed here. Piece D, you'll see, is done except for pieces 11 and 12. So I'm going to discuss with you now how to do pieces 11 and 12, because they're just, we were hampered, we had a limitations problem. This piece needs to finish, the whole block needs to finish at 14.5 inches square. The paper only comes in 8.5 by 14 inches. So the choices were either up the cost of the pattern by having it printed professionally, or by showing you a quick pattern hack here, so which is what I'm going to do now. Piece D is printed on 8.5 by 14 inch paper, but again, it needs to finish at 14.5 inches wide. So what we did was we attached piece 1 with our basting stitches, the back of the fabric to the back of the paper, and then we added all the other pieces by using our fold, cut, flip, stitch method. And now we're going to add pieces 11 and 12, and we're going to use fold, cut, flip, stitch. But what we're going to do is these pieces, you've been told in your directions to cut them 4 inches by 7.5 inches. Okay? And what we're going to do is add them now. At this point, I'm about to use this piece, and these up here are driving me crazy. And you're going to get to a point at some point where you think, why is all this fabric hanging off? What can I trim? And the answer to that question is, you can trim anything beyond your dashed line. That dashed line, you need to attach the piece to piece A to piece, you need to attach piece A to B to C to D. And you need those dashed lines to do that. But anything beyond the dashed line can go. So at this point, I'm making sure everything on the front of my pattern is nice and flat. And I'm going to take my ruler, and I am just going to trim away a lot of this fabric that's hanging over, because it's driving me nuts. And now I can add piece 11 and 12 without so much extra fabric flopping around. Okay, so to add piece 11, we're going to, we've got some stitches hanging out there. So we're going to loosen those up with our seam ripper. And then we're going to fold. And then we're going to cut. And then we're going to flip it over, and we're going to add this piece. Raw edges together, and I can see this is going to be a problem. And now we're going to flip it back over and stitch on our line. Thank you. Okay, lower my needle into my dot. Make sure I'm all lined up here. I am. And stitch. And we're back at 1.3, we're not basting. I'm about to sew over this corner, and you can see that you're going to stitch right through the point, and what's going to happen when we turn it over is you're going to have a very precise corner of the roof of your house. That's one reason you want to make sure you're sewing right on the line. Trim away my thread. And now we're going to press as we sewed, and then back, and look at the corner of my house, of the roof. Now, I just got done telling you that you can trim away any extra beyond the edge of your paper. On piece D, we're gonna leave it because we're gonna need this extra over here, and we're gonna have a little bit extra on the other side as well to make our piece be 14.5 inches. So we're on the last piece. We're on piece 12. We're gonna pull back our paper with our seam ripper. We're gonna fold, and when I fold back, I see, uh-oh, something's wrong. There's no fabric there. It's because he's misbehaving and trying to make a wrinkle. We're gonna cut. We're gonna add our last piece of fabric, right sides together, raw edges together. And then we're gonna flip it over and we're gonna stitch. Where's my thread? Hold on, I'm having an argument with the sewing machine.
Except you're losing.
It did look like I was losing, didn't it? I wanted my thread. Oh, we're good. All right.
Last piece.
It is the last piece. Then all we have to do is sew the sections together, which is not hard at all. Okay, couple stitches beyond. And we are done using fold, cut, flip, stitch, and press. I press this piece back. And then give this I always kind of go over the whole thing when I'm done. And now we gotta trim this guy up. We're gonna trim the top and the bottom, but not the sides. We actually need a big ruler because this one's so long. Remember, we're gonna trim on the dotted line. And we're going to leave the sides so that we know this piece is big enough, which again is not the way this normally works, but again, this way we can print it here. Okay, so there's the top. So now we have to get these guys to go together to make our house. So how are we going to do that? Well, we are going to use our Wonder Clips that I had you get out at the beginning and we haven't used. All right, we're going to take piece A and attach it to piece B. And what we are trying to do is get our raw edges of our fabric and really our paper here to go together. The other thing I should have had you grab was a pin. Let me grab that. I like a pin with a nice big head on it for this. I don't know why. But what we're going to do is we're going to take that pin and stick it through the corner, right here, the very corner of our house. And if we've lined this up well, which I did not, but it looked lined up well, it should come through the corner on the other side. So now we're just going to keep at it until we get the pin to come through. There we go, the corner of the house on that side. So we're going to leave the pin. You want to keep the pin straight up and down. So we've got it through the corner here and coming out the corner on the other side. And then we're going to grab a Wonder Clip and clip it here. Back a little bit because to put it through the sewing machine it needs to be back a little. The edge of the Wonder Clip is right on the line here. This is the line we're going to sew on, guys, right here, this one. And it should be that the Wonder Clip matches up with the same line that you want to sew on the other side. So if it doesn't match up, that means I didn't cut very well, is what it means. So there we go, that's better. And then we're going to do the same thing at the other end. We're going to go to the other end and stick our pin through. And if it doesn't come out perfect, just fuss at it a little bit. There we go, until it does. And then throw a Wonder Clip on down there. Okay? And now, if you've got any problem at all, if this won't lay flat, which it should, but we'll give it a try. But if it doesn't, all you have to do is bend your paper a little bit, arch it, so that you get all of the paper to lay flat and together, okay? What that means is there is some excess fabric somewhere, and the paper is very unforgiving, it's very stiff, and your fabric is a little bit forgiving. So by bending the paper a little bit, you're accommodating the fabric. All my Wonder Clips are on the line back here, except this guy. They're all on the line out here. So we're going to go sew these together. Now when I'm sewing sections together, I actually backstitch just a couple of stitches at the beginning and the end, because these pieces have to stay together and they're holding a lot of other things together. So same way we sewed before, we're going to lower our needle into our dot, lower our presser foot. You cannot sew over Wonder Clips, so you're going to have to take that first one out right away probably. So I'm going to go forward a couple of stitches. I'm going to back stitch just a couple or three, and then I'm going to sew on my line, removing Wonder Clips as I come to them. When I get to the end, I'm going to back stitch 2 or 3, and then I'm going to go forward and now when I open it up, it should look pretty good. If you've sewn way over the roof, you know, then you want to fix that. But at this point, I'm going to take the paper out of the seam I just created. And see how nicely I said that and then it quit pulling away nicely. How nicely it pulls away. And I'm going to do that on both sides. but I'm not going to take the paper out of the rest of it quite yet. If you ever find yourself having to rip out with foundation paper piecing, it's a pain, but what you want to do is before you rip, go grab a piece of Scotch tape and just put it over the seam you're ripping out. And now we come to every quilter's conundrum. What do I do? Because what I don't want to do is put my iron on here because this is toner and toner is heat activated. So if I put my iron onto my paper, it's going to say B11, BG is background. It's going to say BG background on my iron. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just press from this side, and this is the only time I do this. And I'm going to flip it and make sure, see, my seam didn't behave itself. So what I'm going to do is lay it down this way, make sure my seam is all good, and then press it again. That's better. Okay, so now we're going to add piece C to this side, the same way we just did it. We're going to try to line it up as best we can. And then we're going to grab our pin and poke it through the corner, and I did it right on that time, so that's exciting. Add my Wonder Clip. Go to the other end. Poke it through the corner. Find out I was almost there. So I leave the top layer on my pin and I just try to get my bottom layer. There we go. Except I didn't go through my fabric. I don't think that's ever happened before. Okay, back in. Make sure my pin is, because if it's like this, your bottom layer is shifted. You want to make sure your pin is straight up and down. Put your Wonder Clip on. Put your Wonder Clip on here. Okay. All right, and now we're going to stitch this one on. We're joining two sections, so we'll back stitch. And when I'm approaching the edge of the roof, I'm going to make sure that I am very careful not to cut off my point. The good thing about this pattern is there's not a lot of things that have to match up. If you're ever doing a foundation paper piecing pattern where you have to match up, it's really important, say that you're joining two sections and there's a window that has to match up exactly with that window. You want to use the pin the same way you use your pin in the corners. You want to use it at any point that you really need to match up, and you want to make sure it matches before you sew. Because while there is ripping out in foundation paper piecing, it can be a challenge. So you want to do everything you can ahead of time so that you don't have to rip out later. Okay, we're just going to take the paper out of the seam allowances so we can press and don't have too much bulk. And now I'm going to lay it on my pressing mat, make sure my seam is flat, and fold it open and press. We're almost there. Okay. All right, last piece. This guy, remember I told you, he's not exactly, we've got extra fabric on the edges. So all you want to do is make sure it's centered on here. And the best thing about this wonky haunted house is if you end up with your top level over here or over here a little bit, it's not going to matter. All right? So we're going to... Well, right, you've got to make sure that you have, you can't do this because then you don't have fabric over here on this edge. But my point is simply, if your top level is a slightly off center, it just adds to the effect that that top level was added with some kind of evil magic. Otherwise, why would it be staying up there like that? Okay, so we're going to fold this guy on, we're going to lay this right sides together. And with this one, there's not a whole lot to match up. But instead, what we're going to do is sort of what I just told you. I'm going to clip my Wonder Clips on in the middle section. And then I'm going to pull it back and make sure. See? It's approximately centered. And then I know I've got fabric on the edge over here and over here. So I'm going to grab some more Wonder Clips to hold them together. So this piece is the easiest one to add. We saved the easiest one for last. You don't have a stitch line here. This is a 1/4 inch. I haven't sewn with my 1/4 inch foot this entire time. So instead of adding my 1/4 inch foot and all of that, I'm just going to take my line and I'm going to grab a friction pen and I'm just going to extend my line onto the fabric. Okay, down there and down here. And now we are going to sew our last seam and we'll have a haunted house. Whoops. That wasn't in my line. There we go. All right. Back stitch a little bit. Mostly with this, it's a long seam, so we want to be careful that there's not any shifting in our fabric. That the top piece, the D piece, doesn't slide over. We want to make sure that we're keeping the raw edges all together. When we get to the end here, we want to make sure we're back stitch. I can feel with my fingers where the edge of my fabric is. We don't want to be back stitching through only the one layer of fabric. Okay. Okay. So now we have our finished haunted house. What we're going to do to trim up the edges over here, I'm going to pull the paper out of the seams and do a press, and then we're going to trim it up. Whoops. If your paper, it's easier if you fold it back first, and then it should rip. If you've used that 1.3 stitch length, this is why you were doing it, because the paper is perforated and it'll pull out real easy. If you don't want to put too much, if you're tugging too much, you can pull your stitches out. So if you're having that trouble, then your stitch length wasn't as small as it should be. All right, so got this on here. You see we've got nice pointy peaks on our roof. Here where there's a lot of layers of fabric, just actually push on your iron to flatten them out a little bit. Use some pressure. You can see it. And over here, fold it back. It seems like a lot of fussing, but pressing these is what really gives you a nice, crisp, professional looking finish. Once you've done that, grab your big long ruler, double check that you've got 14.5 inches down here, and then take your ruler, I'm lining it up here, and just trim off okay, and there you have it. Now you can go find your favorite show on TV, sit down, and rip all the paper off. Because you don't want to sew all that paper into your final quilt. But now is a great time to go ahead and start ripping the paper out, okay? And then we will be back with a video about how to put your whole quilt together. Good luck!